In his UN speech, Donald Trump talked about Iran and Saudi Arabia, and he made clear that he's a fraud in these comments. That may seem like, that may sound strong, but I say that because it's true. So let's watch, and then I'll explain exactly why this outs him as a fraud and a con man.
In the Middle East, our new approach is also yielding great strides and very historic change. Following my trip to Saudi Arabia last year, the Gulf countries opened a new center to target terrorist financing. They are enforcing new sanctions, working with us to identify and track terrorist networks, and taking more responsibility for fighting terrorism and extremism in their own region. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have pledged billions of dollars to aid the people of Syria and Yemen, and they are pursuing multiple avenues to ending Yemen's horrible, horrific civil war. Ultimately, it is up to the nations of the region to decide what kind of future they want for themselves and their children. To the humanitarian crisis in Syria must also include a strategy to address the brutal regime that has fueled and financed it, the corrupt dictatorship in Iran. Iran's leaders sow chaos, death, and destruction. They do not respect their neighbors or borders or the sovereign rights of nations. Instead, Iran's leaders plunder the nation's resources to enrich themselves and to spread mayhem across the Middle East and far beyond. The Iranian people are rightly outraged that their leaders have embezzled billions of dollars from Iran's treasury, seized valuable portions of the economy, and looted the people's religious endowments, all to line their own pockets and send their proxies to wage war. Not good.
I like how he had to end with a Trumpism there. Not good. Not good. So, here's the reason why this little clip proves he's a fraud. Donald Trump has been accusing the Democrats of doing the bidding of the deep state and doing the bidding of the establishment. That was one of his biggest arguments on the campaign trail against Hillary Clinton, is that she represents the elites, she represents the establishment. What Donald Trump proved there is he is 100% doing the bidding of the deep state. It's not a question. It's not up in the air. He is continuing the exact same kind of policies that we saw under George W. Bush, under Barack Obama to an extent, to be fair, and now he's continuing. So, in other words, Israel and Saudi Arabia are right about everything. We're going to defend them no matter what. And the big bad devil in the region is Iran, and they're the ones who are causing international chaos. That is a giant load of shit. That's what that is. So now you are doing the bidding of the neocons and the deep state as you pretend like you're anti-establishment. No, you're the establishment's puppet. You are the establishment's puppet. That's what that proves. And your policies back up your words here, which is terrible. I'd rather you just pay lip service to the establishment and neocons and then, maybe do the opposite when it comes to policy. He's not doing that. He's doing their bidding. So let's run through this. I like how he said Saudi Arabia is now committed to targeting terrorists. Excuse you? Saudi Arabia is arming and funding terrorists in Yemen and in Syria. They've propped up jihadist rebels in Syria. That's not my opinion, that's a fact. On the ground in Yemen, Saudi Arabia is arming Sunni militias. Now, why are they doing that? Because Shia Houthis took over the government, so now Saudi Arabia doesn't have control of Yemen, so they're arming Sunni militias on the ground. Who are those Sunni militias? Al-Qaeda. So they're arming and supporting and funding Al-Qaeda, and Donald Trump has the nerve to say in front of the world that Saudi Arabia is targeting terrorists. Then he goes on to say, the Gulf states are using, all the available options to aid Syria and Yemen. They're responsible for the destruction of those countries. They're the people who are bombing civilians left and right in Yemen. I mean, we talk about it on a regular basis on this show, how Saudi Arabia is indiscriminately bombing mosques, they're bombing hospitals, they're bombing schools and open-air markets. I mean, and they're doing it with our weapons and our support, so we're aiding what is effectively a genocide. They're also blockading the country and not allowing in food and medicine, so there are people who are literally starving to death and people who are dying of cholera, which is preventable. So as they basically strangle the country to death and massacre civilians on purpose, Trump has the nerve to get up there and say, the Gulf states are aiding Syria and Yemen. Yeah, in the same way that the Nazis aided the Jews. You may say that's an extreme comparison. It's not. It's the truth. It's what's really happening in Yemen. So I don't care if you're triggered or offended by that. That's accurate to say that. So then we get to the comments on Iran, which are hilarious for this reason. Virtually everything he accuses Iran of being guilty of, the U.S. is guilty of. So he says, there's a corrupt dictatorship in Iran. And by the way, to an extent, yes, that is true. They are a dictatorship, they are a theocracy, they are corrupt. Granted all that. But this argument coming from Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, is hilariously ironic and hypocritical and absurd. So, they're a corrupt dictatorship. Well, we are massively corrupt. Insanely corrupt. He says Iran doesn't respect the sovereign right of nations. This is coming from the country, the U.S., that's currently bombing 8 different countries and doing full-scale illegal wars in 2 countries. We destroyed an entire country, Iraq, and it was an illegal war, and we killed minimum 200,000 civilians, and we didn't respect the sovereignty of their borders. And as we do that, we say Iran doesn't respect the sovereign right of nations. It's beyond parody. And then finally, my favorite one, he says the rich in Iran, plunder and steal from the people. What? So now all of a sudden, Donald Trump, President of the United States, the U.S. government is concerned about plundering and stealing from the people and looting when it's a different country. But when you look at so income inequality now is suddenly an important issue, which is not in regards to the U.S., where we have maybe the most income inequality. But it's in Iran, that's the problem. The income inequality, they're plundering and stealing from the people. That's what they're doing. And when Jeff Bezos rigs the government and pays $0.00 in taxes, but he has over $100 billion, that's somehow not stealing from the people. When the elite 1% in this country decide to put all their money in offshore tax havens to avoid their taxes, and they put it in the Cayman Islands and they put it in Bermuda, and they shift the tax burden onto working class people, that's not plundering and stealing from the people. When Wall Street gets a giant bailout after they bankrupted their companies and crashed the economy, and then they pay bonuses to the people who made those terrible decisions and did fraud as a business model, that's not plundering and stealing from the people. Even though literally is that, because you took working class people's tax money and gave it to the rich who fucked everything over in the first place. So do you see the problem here? When the U.S. lectures about human rights, when the U.S. lectures about income inequality against other countries, it's all convenient propaganda because they're official state enemies. So when we have an official state enemy, say everything negative about them, everything bad about them ever, and highlight it, even if some of those things are true. But when it's an ally, you say only good things about Israel is wonderful, Saudi Arabia is wonderful. They're fighting terrorists. Even they are a Wahhabi regime. They literally are killing women who were protesting for the right to drive. The women who led that protest, They just got sentenced to death. They behead people in the public square for sorcery and witchcraft and apostasy and drug smuggling. And you have the nerve to say they're fighting terrorists? They are the terrorists. So this proves that Donald Trump is a fraud and a con man, because he's doing the bidding of the establishment and the deep state as he pretends like he's against them. And that's a really important point. Very few people are making it. We're going to cover a Noam Chomsky segment later where he touches on that point. But I think it needs to be called out more. And what annoys me is the only part of Trump's UN speech that really got a lot of coverage is the part where everybody laughed at him. So this is not getting a lot of coverage, even though it deserves a lot of coverage. It is incredibly important. But it gets nothing because you grandfather in all of the absurdity in international relations and all the hypocrisy on human rights. Just don't even talk about that, because we're all part of the U.S. empire, so the mainstream media is complicit in it, and they're all part of that elite class anyway, so push that to the side, ignore that. Oh, we're only going to talk about how Trump was laughed at and not substantive policy issues. Well, you should talk about the substantive policy issues, because they're even more important than when everybody laughed at him.